Joe, Deb, all the members of the World Affairs Council, thank you so much for having me here. This is my first time in Colorado. I've transited through your wonderful airport, but this is the first time I've actually gotten to leave the airport. And so I got here a little early and I enjoyed the view outside. Now I understand why people love it so much out here. So thank you for having me. And as I was telling Joe and others, it's always a privilege to get outside of the Beltway. We talk a lot about U.S. China relations, Chinese foreign policy inside the Beltway, but I'm eager to hear what you all are thinking, how you see sort of the challenge that our country faces. And so when you're asking the question, feel free to build in your points of view as well, because I love hearing those. So what I'd like to do is use the next 30 minutes to lay out the state of U.S. China relations as I see it. The United States policies towards China under the Trump administration, and China's strategy for navigating the second Trump presidency. And then I'll turn over to what some have called a new axis of autocracy. So Deb mentioned that I had just written on this topic. So this axis basically refers to China, Russia, and North Korea. How many of you all saw the military parade? That was about a month ago. With Chinese President Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, and Kim Jong-un standing together in Tiananmen Square. And it was a very striking moment. And so I'm going to be talking about how should we be interpreting this new axis. But first, with regards to where the U.S. Policy towards China is headed, let me begin with the bottom line. I don't believe that the Trump administration currently has a coherent strategy towards China. What we do know is that the president and the administration is focused on addressing economic imbalances in the U.S.-China relationship. And President Trump has initiated and escalated a trade war to try to address these imbalances. However, at this stage, both Washington and Beijing are essentially locked in a pattern of tactical maneuvering. Each side seems to be focused on short-term gains. And my concern is that the Trump administration has not yet articulated a clear set of objectives when it comes to what is it that we want from China. What kind of U.S.-China economic relationship should we be aiming for? We understand that it's unbalanced, but what should it look like when we get out of the tunnel? We haven't had too much clarity there. In fact, I think neither Washington nor Beijing have offered a viable vision for what a mutually acceptable bilateral relationship, broadly speaking, should look like. And I think the reason for this lack of vision is that at the heart of the trade war lies two deeply entrenched perspectives that are hard to reconcile. So on the U.S. side, there have been long complaints about Chinese overcapacity, unfair trade practices, and China's state-directed economic model that has distorted global market competition. There's a bipartisan view that China's economic practices have harmed U.S. industries. They've hollowed out domestic manufacturing. They've made U.S. supply chains too dependent on China and generally reshaped the global economy in a way that's unfairly skewed in China's favor. So the United States has traditionally called for China to alter its state-led model, its state-subsidized economic model. But this is a model that Beijing sees as integral to its own development strategy and to the legitimacy of the Communist Party. Beijing, on the other hand, views U.S. actions, like the trade war, as part of a broader strategy to contain China's rise. So Beijing does not believe that U.S. tariffs or U.S. export restrictions or sanctions on Chinese tech firms have anything to do really with Chinese economic practices, or it's not really about fairness or correcting the imbalances, but that this is about preserving American dominance. So this is the view that we see often in China. And what China wants for the United States to do is ease export restrictions, bring down the tariffs, and continue trading without fundamentally changing its economic model or practices that triggered these measures in the first place. I think what makes all of this more challenging is that each side seems to believe that it can endure the pain of a trade war better than the other. So Washington sees China as too dependent on the U.S. consumer market. It believes that the United States has a superior innovation ecosystem and that it's confident that it's going to be able to rally other states to work with the United States to isolate and try to make changes in China. Beijing, for its part, is equally confident in its long-term resilience. It believes that the Chinese public is more tolerant of economic hardship than American citizens, that its efforts to diversify trade, to strengthen self-reliance, to boost its tech industry, and to tap into its vast domestic market will ultimately reduce its vulnerability. I think the reality is there's overconfidence on both sides. Yes, China can absorb pain, but it also needs stability as it contends with serious domestic pressures like youth unemployment, deflation, a deepening property crisis. And while Beijing may be accelerating its push for indigenous innovation, it still remains quite dependent on advanced U.S. technologies, especially semiconductors. It relies on global financial networks where the United States plays a big role. And it does need access to international consumer markets, including the American market. Yes, the United States has considerable economic leverage, but it cannot insulate itself from the costs of disruption. So U.S. manufacturers, retailers, tech firms are deeply tied to the Chinese production ecosystem. And consumers as well, depend on a lot of products that come from China. So supply chain volatility, inflation, and waning confidence in the U.S. economy are already taking a toll. And on top of that, the Trump administration's alienation of many of the United States' allies and partners raises questions on Washington's ability to forge a cohesive coalition to better negotiate with China. So again, I think both sides are being a little bit too confident or overconfident here. Now, what's interesting is that there's a divide within the Trump administration itself on what kind of economic relationship that the United States should have with China. I think for President Trump, his focus is on selling more to China, also growing U.S. manufacturing at home. The goal for him is not economic decoupling with China, but basically redistributing the ledger so that China buys more from the United States. Whereas there are others in the administration who are more hawkish. They are more skeptical of remaining economically tied with China. They believe that the United States should not sell any high-tech goods to China because this could directly or indirectly fuel its military and technological development. And they certainly have no interest in Chinese investment coming into the United States. And these people would be the same ones who are very skeptical about a potential TikTok deal. Have you guys been following that? Where President Trump is very keen to keep TikTok in the U.S. and he sort of waves away the national security concerns that are tied with the app, whereas others in his orbit are much more concerned. And so it's interesting to see this divide even within the Trump administration. And so it'll be interesting to see where the administration ultimately lands on these questions. Will it lean towards more transactional deal making? Or is it going to push for a broader strategic decoupling with China? I think the answer is still TBD. And beyond trade, there's still considerable uncertainty around what, if any, other pillars should define the U.S.-China relationship. So while U.S.-China cooperation has never been easy at any point, and folks like Richard who have worked in China for a long time will know this very well, we've had previous administrations who have managed to work with Chinese counterparts on issues like climate change or on issues like curbing fentanyl. What's concerning to me is that there's not much energy or attention that is being given to other problems and other global crises that the U.S. and China really should be working on together. It seems like trade is sort of sucking up all the energy right now. Now turning to Beijing. So what is Beijing's playbook for the second Trump administration? So since President Trump's election last November, Chinese leaders have tried to signal that the ball is in the United States court to determine the trajectory of the U.S. China relationship. So the message has been that the United States can either choose to have a friendly, cooperative relationship, or it can choose to have a confrontational approach, and China is ready for either of these paths. And as the trade war has escalated between the two countries, we've seen Beijing take a much more combative tone, declaring that China is ready for not just a trade war, but any kind of war with the United States. And Chinese officials have made it clear that Beijing will not be coerced into negotiations on unfavorable terms. And I think Beijing is trying to do multiple things here. It's trying to juggle various priorities. It wants to project confidence, not to look weak in front of U.S. pressure, especially with the eye towards its own domestic audience. But at the same time, I do think it wants to preserve some space for trade negotiations with the Trump administration. Now, sitting in Washington, I've had the chance to see both the first trade war and the second trade war play out. And this one feels different from the first one. It's really interesting. I do think that Beijing has taken a much harder line. They've rolled out export restrictions on rare earths. They've tightened regulatory pressure on U.S. Firms that are operating inside China. And so they are really sort of using the coercive tools much more this time around. I think last time, the last trade war during the first Trump administration, there were actually a lot of Chinese delegations who came to Washington. They wanted to test the waters on potential investment deals and purchase agreements. But this time, I think that kind of engagement is a lot less, is not happening as much. And I think the reason is because there's a widespread belief inside China that the first trade deal did little to shield China from sort of U.S. competitive measures, and that the relationships still continue to nosedive even after that first trade deal was made. And so there's sort of a different attitude, I think, this time around. So China, I think, has I would put it as a three-part strategy to deal with the second Trump presidency. And the three parts are strengthen, hedge, and engage. The first pillar, which is strengthen, focuses on boosting China's own internal resilience through investment in its own high-tech industries, in stimulating domestic consumption, increasing defense spending so that they have better military capabilities. The second pillar, hedging, centers on stabilizing and deepening ties with other states, especially Russia, as well as states in the global south, and with U.S. allies in Europe and Asia as China looks towards long-term competition with the United States. And finally, the third pillar, engaging, refers to dealing bilaterally with Washington. Now, to be clear, this strategy is not new to the Trump era. These three pillars have long defined how China thinks about its foreign policy. But I think the two pillars, strengthen and hedging, have gained much more salience now that U.S.-China relations have come under strain. For instance, on the hedging front, Moscow has evolved into Beijing's most important partner, especially since President Xi's rise to power in 2012. We've seen a steady strengthening of relations between these two countries across the economic, political, and military domains over the last decade and a half. In addition to shoring up ties with Russia, Beijing has also invested significant resources to court friends in the global south. So China's Belt and Road Initiative, have you all heard of that? Yes, so that's long been a signature face of China's strategy. But in recent years, we've seen Beijing kind of scale back the Belt and Road Initiative as it deals with its own domestic economic headwinds, but it's at the same time stepped up to try to position itself as a leader of non-Western coalitions like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or the BRICS, and to position itself as a shaper of global norms and a great power diplomatic broker. And over the last few months, the United States has done a lot to alienate many of its allies and partners by threatening tariffs and casting doubts on our security commitments and questioning the utility of our long-standing alliances. And so Beijing has sought to leverage this moment to present itself as a responsible and inclusive power, as a defender of free trade and international law, and to draw a sharp contrast between itself and the United States America First approach. So Beijing has gained some diplomatic traction by doing this, but it hasn't succeeded in peeling away all of the United States' friends and partners. And why is because when it comes to Europe, I think there are multiple factors that complicate China's efforts to exploit transatlantic divisions. So in the past, you might have thought, well, China might have a pretty good chance in Europe to try to drive a wedge between the United States and its European allies, then driving a wedge between the U.S. and its Asian allies, because China doesn't have territorial disputes in the region. It doesn't have as much of a fraught historical legacy with Europe, but the strategic landscape has significantly changed since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, because China's substantial economic and diplomatic support for Moscow has helped Russia sustain its war efforts, and it's weakened international attempts to try to isolate the Kremlin. And so this alignment between China and Russia has really raised alarms across Europe, where Beijing may have once been seen as an economic player, an economic threat, if you see it as a threat or an economic opportunity, but now it's seen as an enabler of an existential threat to European security. And so this really undermines China's attempts to brand itself as a responsible global stakeholder and as a stabilizing alternative to the United States. Turning to Asia. In Asia, skepticism of China runs deeper because most states, from Japan to South Korea to China's neighbors in Southeast Asia, all have territorial disputes with China. And so they've long faced direct threats to their sovereignty, and they've all experienced Chinese economic coercion and retaliation as well. And so there's a lot of skepticism, and there's complicated relationships out there. And so my point is, while U.S. foreign policy under this administration has certainly caused concerns among many of the United States allies, it has not triggered widespread abandonment of the United States or widespread bandwagoning with China, because Beijing's own behavior, its own record in the region, limit its appeal. And in fact, there is still strong demand across Asia for continued U.S. engagement. There is deep frustration with the trade war, with tariffs, and many U.S. allies like Japan and South Korea are worried that the United States may not stand up for its alliance commitments, or that it no longer sees them as friends but as rivals. But they are not, at this point, rethinking their alliances with the United States. They still want the U.S. to remain engaged. And that's same with the ASEAN countries, the countries in Southeast Asia, where they don't want just one big power, China, active in their region. They want many big powers so that they can hedge and balance among these powers. Europeans also remain committed to NATO. They don't see any viable alternatives to the United States in helping keep peace in their region. And so the demand for the United States still remains strong. I think the U.S. has a strong legacy and record of contributions in Asia and Europe. This has withstood turbulence in many previous administrations, and it's not going to be dismantled overnight. Now, coming to the third pillar of China's strategy, engaging with the United States. Beijing has shown that it does want to keep channels of communication open. We've seen high-level officials between the two countries have more contact in the last several weeks. We've seen our trade negotiators talk in Stockholm and in Madrid. Secretary Rubio has met with his counterpart, Foreign Minister Wang Yi. And so there's been some back and forth between the two countries. Now, having said that, I think Chinese leaders view this pillar of engaging with the United States with the most uncertainty. I think at present there's real confusion inside China what the Trump administration's true intentions toward China are. So do they really want a trade deal, or are they just escalating tensions for strategic or political gain? And I think this ambiguity is compounded by the internal divisions within the Trump administration that I talked about, where some people want to stay economically engaged with China and others think that that's a bad choice. More broadly, I think the prevailing view in Beijing is one of resignation. The belief is that Washington sees China as its primary long-term adversary, and no matter what China does, this view is not going to change. It's not going to change regardless of who is in the White House. And so I think Chinese leaders are increasingly skeptical that bilateral engagement can deliver meaningful breakthroughs. Which is concerning, right? Which is concerning when the two biggest powers in the world are not talking with each other or not trying to cooperate to figure out many of the problems that are existent in our world. I do expect Beijing, I don't think this means that Beijing is going to walk away from dealing with Washington. I think they're going to continue to engage with Washington, but with far more limited expectations. And I think China is going to double down instead on its two other pillars of its strategy, which is doing more at home to strengthen its domestic resilience and hedging by looking to other partners around the world to get things done. On that note, I want to turn now to one of the most striking manifestations of China's hedging strategy, and that's the growing alignment that I alluded to between China, Russia, and North Korea. So some have described this as the axis of autocracies. And again, we saw this on full display when we saw Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, and Kim Jong-un standing together on the viewing platform at China's military parade just a month ago in Beijing. And let me note that it's very clear what these three autocrats were trying to do by appearing together. This was a very carefully choreographed moment designed to project an image of unity and defiance against the United States. That's what they were trying to do. But as I recently wrote in my essay for Foreign Affairs, I think beneath the surface, beneath this image of unity, there's actually a much more complicated reality. So China, Russia, and North Korea have a tactical alignment today that is rooted not in trust or shared values or real friendship, but really by shared grievances against the United States and a global order that they believe is skewed towards the West. And so we've seen a lot more coordination among these countries that have real consequences. So for instance, North Korea is providing troops and artillery to Russia as it continues its illegal invasion of Ukraine. And in return, it's receiving Russian military technology, it's receiving oil, food aid, it's receiving the ability to send its workers to Russia to serve as cheap labor. Of course, none of that money goes to the actual workers who are out there. It goes straight back to the regime. China is helping Russia's war economy stay afloat by purchasing Russian oil, selling it dual-use technologies like machine tools, jet engine parts, and semiconductors. And so the Chinese government, when they get pressed on this, they like to say, well, this is normal trade. We're not sending them missiles or bullets. This is just everyday trade. Of course, that's not the truth. And of course, they're doing a lot to buttress Russia. But right now, their priority is keeping this friendship with the Russians. But if you look at the history, if you just look a few decades back, it's very clear that these three countries are not natural allies. And there is plenty of rivalry and suspicion among all three states. So the last time that these three states were all this united was at the start of the Cold War in 1950, when Kim Il-sung, who's Kim Jong-un's grandfather, launched an invasion of South Korea with the support of the Soviet Union and China. But as you all know, the gamble failed. So the Korean Peninsula, after the Korean War, remains divided. North Korea became the isolated pariah state that it is today. And meanwhile, South Korea, its rival, backed by the United States, has flourished and become this amazing democracy, top economy in the world. And for China, the intervention was especially costly. So hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops died. The war drained resources from a country that was already torn because of its own civil war. And strategically, the war backfired from Beijing's perspective because it entrenched a permanent U.S. military presence on China's doorstep in South Korea. And it also derailed China's opportunity to try to take Taiwan, which it still sees as its own territory and that the Chinese Communist Party today believes is unfinished business. So for Beijing, the Korean War offered a sobering lesson. Aligning with allies like North Korea out of ideological solidarity brought enormous costs and long-term liabilities. And it wasn't China that just walked away with grievances during the Cold War. North Korea, despite the fact that it received a lot of help from the Soviets, even more from the Chinese, came to resent the two great powers because of what they saw as heavy-handed approaches to North Korea. And so even as North Korea continued to play Moscow and Beijing off of each other to extract aid and to get concessions, it also sort of refused to fully align or submit to these great power neighbors. It was very much, it believed that it needed to be independent. It would purge officials that it saw as too close to China or too close to the Soviets. It was very jealous of its own independence. And meanwhile, during the Korean War, China became actually quite disillusioned with its ally Moscow for not fully providing military support during the war. They felt like the burden unfairly fell on Chinese shoulders. And so this kind of resentment added to the grievances that piled up and became the Sino-Soviet split, which was already under the way by the 1950s. And this would lead to Chinese and Russian troops actually shooting against each other in 1969, just the next decade. So the point is, there's a deep and complicated history there, and their memories are not short. They still are very much relevant. And fast forward to today, and similar distrust persists. So Russians still worry about Chinese encroachment into Siberia and their border regions. In fact, there was an article in the New York Times earlier this year which talked about Russian intelligence labeling China as the enemy in their internal documents. That's not how you talk about real allies and partners, citing fears of espionage and citing fears of Chinese expansionist aims. Meanwhile, Beijing is very unhappy about Russia and North Korea's growing ties. So since the war in Ukraine, Pyongyang has become the Kremlin's, one of the Kremlin's most important partners, again, by sending troops and military supplies to help Putin continue his war against Ukraine. In exchange, Russia has deepened their diplomatic exchanges, it's transferred sensitive military technologies, and it's even signed a mutual defense pact with North Korea, reviving a pact that once existed back earlier in the Cold War. And I think Beijing does not see this as a good thing. It's deeply uneasy about the fact that it's they're both Chinese friends, but that its friends are getting closer to each other than China is with them. And Chinese experts, admit when they talk in private that they are disturbed by the lack of transparency around what it is that actually Russians are providing to the North Koreans when it comes to military technologies. And I think ultimately Beijing is very uncomfortable because it lacks control over this scenario. And they're not, if you think about it, if we thought about our allies working together, if we saw South Korea and Japan working together to boost their capabilities, I think the United States would see that as a plus. We would see that as additive to our power and the power balance around the world. But it's fascinating that the Chinese don't see Russia and North Korea working together as something that is additive to this axis. And so it really tells you, what is this axis like? And again, I think the Chinese don't like the fact that they lack control. They are very concerned about the prospects of instability on the Korean Peninsula and the region. They're very concerned that a North Korea that is emboldened by a Russian security guaranteed or emboldened by Russian military technology is going to create problems for China on its doorstep. I think the Chinese are also very unhappy that Putin has replaced Xi as Kim's closest partner. And so the spectacle that we saw in Beijing earlier this month with President Xi literally rolling out the red carpet for Kim Jong-un was in large part an effort by Beijing to try to shift the balance that they thought had gone too much in Russia's favor. Now, so what does this mean for the United States? First, I think it's important for us to avoid sort of the temptation to see China, Russia, and North Korea as an axis that is a monolith. That's exactly what these three countries want us to believe. But again, for all the reasons that I laid out, that is far from the truth. I think it's important to realize that the three states do not have the same strategic outlooks or interests. And we need to ask, what strategic opportunities does this provide to the United States? So what does China want? I think China wants to reshape the international order in its favor, but without blowing it up. It wants stability. It wants to stay interconnected with Western markets. You know, China's biggest advantage is that it's a powerful economy. It does not want wars and to inject instability because that's bad for its own continued rise. Russia, on the other hand, is not an economic power player. I think it's more willing to play a spoiler role. It has fewer constraints because it has fewer options and therefore a higher tolerance for risk. North Korea is also in that boat. I think it's more transactional, opportunistic. It's going to do everything it can to try to extract as much as it can from both China and Russia while keeping them at arm's length. And ultimately, it's going to try to extract something from the United States as well. And so Kim Jong-un showing up in Beijing last month, part of that was to lay the groundwork so that he can engage with the United States, because President Trump, as you all know, have expressed interest in meeting with Kim. The last time they met was in 2018 in Hanoi, when a U.S. effort to strike a deal with the North Koreans fell through. And President Trump has said that he wants to see the North Koreans again. And so they are getting ready to negotiate with the United States. Now, I think the fact that the three countries have different priorities, different outlooks, this doesn't necessarily give the United States a sweeping strategic opening. But I think this does give the U.S. some room to maneuver, provided that we can engage each of these three states with purpose and with discipline. So with China, the United States holds meaningful leverage because Beijing wants economic stability. It wants to avoid direct competition with the United States, which would significantly jeopardize its economy, its continued ascent. Beijing would rather have a trade deal with the US, even if it doesn't believe that this is going to be a panacea for all the problems in the bilateral relationship. Because to come to some kind of agreement would be better than to have the relationship basically fall off a cliff, because this would create more problems for Beijing. And so I think given this reality, this creates an opportunity for Washington to condition progress on a trade deal and progress on a Trump-Xi meeting on bilateral cooperation on global and regional crises, like curbing ending the war in Ukraine, or curbing North Korea's unchecked nuclear weapons expansion. Now, to be sure, Beijing is going to resist efforts to try to resist efforts if we make them publicly break with Moscow or Pyongyang. But I think private pressure from the highest levels could force Beijing to take modest but meaningful adjustments, like slowing the purchase of Russian oil, or curbing dual-use exports to Moscow, or signaling to Pyongyang that denuclearization must remain a long-term vision or long-term goal in any kind of negotiation. With Russia, Putin has shown very little interest in peace talks that would require him to abandon his maximalist demands in Ukraine. He remains committed to outlasting U.S. and European support for Kiev. But over time, I think Russia will need an off-ramp as its troop losses mount, as economic strains deepen at home, and as public fatigue grows with the war. And this is something that China or North Korea cannot unilaterally give to the Russians. Only the United States, along with Ukraine and its European partners, can give Putin the diplomatic exit that he will one day need. And so I think this, again, gives the United States some leverage. And so Washington shouldn't be rushing into negotiations. Rather, it should look to double down on its strengths. So strengthen coordination with the European allies to enhance Ukraine's ability to defend itself. Find ways that we can make more credible security guarantees so that Russia is not tempted again in the future to violate Ukraine's sovereignty. And for now, apply greater economic pressure on Moscow. And I think a key part of this strategy will need to involve getting China and India to scale back their support for Russia's wartime economy. And again, we should not, I don't think an effective way to do this is through publicly making ultimatums, but through forceful back-channel diplomacy, which would allow Beijing and New Delhi to make adjustments to their current actions without appearing to capitulate to U.S. pressure, which is the last thing that they want to look like they're doing. And with North Korea, the United States, again, has bargaining power. So Kim Jong-un wants sanctions relief, he wants regime security, and he wants recognition of his country as a legitimate nuclear power. Now, there's a limit to how much China and Russia can deliver on these without the United States. And I think despite its anti-American rhetoric, Pyongyang has ultimately, for a long time, pursued a peace deal and normalization with Washington. Not only because this would give them a sense of security, but also more economic opportunities directly from the US, but because normalizing ties with the United States would open opportunities for North Korea around the world. So they would have more access to economic assistance and diplomatic ties with Tokyo, with Seoul, and other players, and this would be a boon for North Korea. And so I don't think we do have leverage here. It should not be squandered for basically a photo op summit, which is unfortunately what happens sometimes. Yeah. And so what should a potential deal between the United States and North Korea look like? Well, I think it should start by reaffirming a joint statement that was actually signed by President Trump himself and Kim Jong-un back in 2018 at their Singapore summit. And so at this summit, the two presidents made a commitment to work towards the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. There was a clear commitment in that statement. And so I think reaffirming that as the basis of any new negotiations, accompanied with looking at ways we can build interim steps to reduce the nuclear risks that North Korea poses while expanding diplomatic, economic, and humanitarian exchanges with this country while we work towards a long-term effort of denuclearization is probably the best way forward. So let me end by returning to the bigger picture. I think we are in a moment of growing disorder. The global balance of power is shifting. And the post-Cold War order, which was essentially U.S. unipolarity, seems to be fraying. And I think China, Russia, and North Korea each want to transition or shape this transition to their advantage. And while their coordination is real, their alignment is uneasy. And again, it's not built on shared purpose or vision. And so I think the challenge for the United States will be to diagnose the challenges that we have precisely. We don't want to underestimate the risks, but we also want to see what the opportunities are out there. And we need to recognize and double down on our comparative advantages. And what are those? U.S. alliances, military power, economic influence, diplomatic reach, rather than dismantling these advantages. I think the U.S. should be doubling down. And I think this will give Washington the best chance to shape the strategic environment instead of just reacting to that. So let me end there. I will look forward to your questions. And again, I welcome your questions, but I would also love to hear your views and how you may be looking at these issues here in Colorado. Thank you.
Thank you. That was terrific. Your framework is fascinating and very coherent. Thank you. There's an exogenous event that Xi Jinping has established, though, that could spoil the whole system, which is Taiwan. And 2027 is approaching rapidly, and Xi Jinping will not want to lose face if 27 comes and goes without him acting on that. Given the background of the strengthening that he's done in the Greater China, the South China Sea, and with diplomacy around the region, I just wonder where you place Taiwan in your framework.
Sure, and thank you for bringing up Taiwan. I mean, we can't ever have a conversation on China without talking about Taiwan. So 2027, I think, there are different views out there on what Xi Jinping meant when he said he wants his military to be ready to go for Taiwan in 2027. Some people see this as that means he's going in 2027. Others see this, they emphasize, hey, this is actually about Xi trying to whip up his military into shape to have the capabilities for a Taiwan contingency in 2027, but that doesn't necessarily mean he wants to do a military invasion of the island. In my view, I'm on more of the latter camp, and I do think that President Xi has talked much more aggressively about Taiwan and that timeline than his predecessors, and so that is absolutely a fact. Having said that, I think the Chinese understand very clearly that a military invasion for Taiwan would be in many ways, first of all, it's not guaranteed that it's going to work because the U.S. still has vast capabilities out there. The U.S. allies are out there. Taiwan has its own capabilities. It's a very risky operation militarily. Second of all, I think he would rather do this without having to fight. And so what the Chinese have been doing is building up the capabilities, trying to signal to the Taiwanese, hey, you have no future as an independent entity, but you will ultimately have to join with us. That's sort of what they're doing. And they've really upped the coercion. They've done more sort of military exercises in the region to get the people of Taiwan scared. And so that's what he's trying to do, try to send that signal. But this is where it's so important where the United States comes out. Because if the U.S., if somebody were to negotiate away our commitment to Taiwan and our friendship with Taiwan, then that would essentially basically hand that victory to Xi without even having to go for it militarily. And so that's a very dangerous situation. I mean, the U.S. policy has been that we do not want to see a violent or coercive change of the status quo. And whatever agreement that the people of Taiwan and the people of China come to resolve this question should be done peacefully. That has always been the U.S. view. And to do that, because China's military capabilities have increased so much, you have to help with the balance so that the Taiwanese they don't feel like they have to be coerced, and they have a way to defend themselves, and they understand that the U.S. is backing them. And so I think that's very important. But again, to get back to the 2027 deadline, I think that if Xi were to carry out an outright military invasion, basically it would be faced with economic decoupling with the United States, probably with the Western economies, and that would be very damaging to China. It cannot survive just by trading with Russia or just by trading with global South countries. It just can't. It can't. So it's. I think they're not going to want to do that. They're going to do everything they can to try to pressure the Taiwanese so that they feel like they have to give in. But that's where the U.S. role is so important as well.
James.
I wonder if you could talk about the demographic situation in China. It's projected that China's population will go from about 1.4 billion now to maybe 330 million by the turn of the next century, or the turn of this century, and how that's going to affect China's ability to project power, number one, how it's going to be able to develop internal markets that it absolutely has to have per what you discussed, and how that's overall affecting China's strategy.
Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't studied the demographics problem as closely, but I just having observed it, I think they are very worried. Actually, this is a problem that not only plagues China, but many of the countries out in Asia, like Japan and South Korea, they are also dealing with their demographic challenges. And so there have been some, government efforts to try to raise the birth rate, which is quite striking because not too long ago, China actually had a one-child policy, and now they're trying to encourage people to have 3 children, not just one. And so they're doing what they can. I think, for the demographic problem to be maybe not resolved, but alleviated somewhat, there needs to be more of a social safety net, and China doesn't have that now. And I think that impacts sort of the consumer market as well, and the fact that people just save a lot more and they have to depend on themselves. They don't have a social security system like we do out here, and so that's a real challenge. On the side of domestic consumption, I think the Chinese government understands that it needs to boost domestic consumption, but they haven't really figured out how to do this yet. And there are multiple priorities here. They want to stimulate the domestic consumer market, but at the same time, they want to put a lot of the government resources into advancing China's cutting edge technologies. So in the AI sector and the quantum sector and so on. And so there are differing priorities right now. I don't think they've quite figured it out yet. But neither has South Korea or Japan. I mean, I think they're all experimenting with how can we boost birth rates and how can we make sure that people feel secure enough to get married and have children. I don't know if that's it's always a full government solution, but they are certainly thinking about it.
Our next question is back here.
Well, you are excellent. Thank you. What I'd like you to do is set up a class that we can take online, because there's a lot of things that you bring up that I would like to talk about. But, in the last 50 years since 1980, Mao died in 1976, and I'm not really great on Chinese names. I can't remember the gentleman that came in 82 or 80. Deng Xiaoping. And really, what China did in 50 years, from 1980 to I guess it's 1910 or 20 or 15, was fantastic. He took 1.4 billion people out of China took 1.4 billion people out of abject poverty, subsistence living, into a middle class. And the Chinese, if you look around the world, they did suffer a lot during our lifetime, basically. And but if you looked at them in Hawaii, you looked at them in Singapore, they were very accomplished people. And what they were able to do, they were given an opportunity, and they did a lot. And to me, the United States is becoming Avis, and China is becoming Hertz. We are slipping down, and with the people we have in Washington now, they're being divisive, and they're not putting out the best people, which China is in their government. They're putting out bad people. And so what I'm looking at is people are going to look at China, and China, we have a problem, but it started, in my opinion, when the West basically did a Marshall Plan for China. And so my reaction is, to me, Xi is a unifier and Trump is a divider, a destroyer. And I don't know if that's the way people are looking at it, and they keep trying to take the United States government and say, well, he doesn't mean that, he doesn't mean that. But he does mean it.
Well, thank you for sharing your views. It's the part about China's economic miracle, absolutely. It's been fascinating to see just how much China has evolved and moved up the economic ladder. Personally, I started going to China, I think it was I was there from the early 2000s and onward. I spent a lot of time out there as a student, and just going back every year, seeing the changes inside China was fascinating, and just how fast they were developing. There was a new subway station that was popping up overnight, literally. You would go and look at the map, and there's a new station, and it was just amazing how fast they were growing. Now, I have to say, since my early student days and now, actually China has changed a lot too, and it's become less dynamic as it once was. And I think with Xi coming in, he's been much more. He's kind of taken the country backwards, China backwards, and there's just a lot less freedom. And I think Chinese bureaucrats today are much, they have less freedom and they have less creativity, because he is much more of an autocratic ruler, I think, than previous the leaders that came before him. And so China's gone that way. I think in many ways the United States is merging with China, where we also have a very powerful president who some say wants to be his own China desk officer. So all policies on China are not debated and made from the working levels up, but our president has ideas about what we should do, and then our government sort of works and implements those ideas. And so there's less creativity in our system as well, and we've seen a real sort of diminishing of the diplomatic corps. And so I think both countries are in this perhaps not the best periods, and we've seen a convergence. In the United States, our country has really thrived because of our free market system, but we see some of that going away with the way the way this administration is intervening with private businesses. And so it's a very interesting time period, and we'll see which model prevails. And this is where I think the United States, again, we should be thinking about what are our comparative advantages and how do we make sure we don't erode those but actually strengthen them. I think that's what we should be doing.
Could you help us understand China's policy towards Africa and the Middle East?
So China has always seen, so the global south or the developing world, China has always sort of seen it as a natural base of support. So if you look back actually to the early 1950s, they would speak of sort of Africa and Southeast Asia as sort of kindred spirits because they had gone through colonialism as well. So China was never fully colonialized, but it says that it was a semi-colony, and then the CCP liberated them, right? So that's the storyline. So they've always seen sort of the non-Western world as natural allies and friends. So that's sort of the baseline of how China views these places. With Africa and the Middle East, we've seen China sort of, especially Africa, really expand its presence in these continents. In Africa, I think it's from like the 90s onward, we've seen sort of Chinese economic inroads. With the Belt and Road Initiative, there was a real boost in sort of Chinese businesses and infrastructure projects out there in the region. In the Middle East, a little bit less so, but still, more involved than it was before. And in both continents, there are a lot of complicated relations among the countries inside, right? And China, what it likes to do is sort of present itself as a neutral player, so that it could talk with both the Saudis and the Iranians, with the Israelis, and so that's sort of the role that China likes to play. But it doesn't get as deeply involved in the politics like the United States has. And so it's a different way of engaging. for sure, I think China has expanded its footprint in both of these regions, and it's been striking to see how much it has done so over the last 20, 30 years. Primarily economic, that's been the major driver of engagement. But as I mentioned, over the last 10 years or so, China has also stepped up to try to position itself as a great power broker. And so it likes to host, Middle Eastern delegations and sort of host like the normalization deal, for instance. It likes to sort of be the convening power, but it doesn't really roll up its sleeve and get deeply involved. So it hosted, for instance, Palestinian factions in China. I think this was a year ago, to show that it's sort of contributing to bringing the end to the war in Gaza. But it hasn't really gotten deeply involved as much as the United States, where President Trump is actually picking up the phone and trying to make negotiate and strike deals. They're not involved in that way yet.
Dr. Kim, a question. You mentioned briefly India, the other country with 1 billion plus people, and they have been buying oil from Russia, I think less to support the war effort, but just to get cheap oil. What role does India play at all in the relationship, either with China or the United States? They've historically had issues between India and China, and now we've seen, new tariffs on India from the United States. So is India a player in this at all?
Well, absolutely. It is a player, and I think there have been efforts by previous administrations to draw India closer to the United States to try to counterbalance China. And so we've seen efforts like the Quad, which includes India as well as Australia, and the United States, Japan. But basically, this time around, President Trump, as you say, has not been very friendly with India. And so we saw Modi show up in Beijing in September as well. And that was his sort of way of pushing back against the United States to say, hey, I have other options as well. And so he met with Putin there, he met with Xi. But I think there's a lot of distrust certainly between China and India. As you mentioned, these are longtime rivals. I think if China has always seen the United States as the biggest threat, India has always seen China as the biggest threat. And so this kind of, in some ways, makes India and the United States sort of natural partners, but this relationship is strained at the moment.
Yeah, back to the Taiwan question. So what does a non-military resolution of the Taiwan question look like?
Well, I think depends on who you ask, right? I mean, no. As in, if you ask Beijing, they would prefer that, but they would want a deal where basically Taiwan accepts that there is one China and that they are part of that China, and maybe they'll get to have some sort of independent government, but it's going to be like Hong Kong, right? Where Beijing has the last say, and that under the One China framework, they can't really do things in Taiwan that go against Beijing's policies. I think that's the model that Beijing would want. For Taiwan, well, I mean, it also depends who you ask inside Taiwan. I think there are different visions of what a stable relationship with China could look like, whether you're asking the KMT or the DPP, which are the two main parties in there. But I think for the Taiwanese, they don't see a good outcome, and they want to maintain the status quo. And for the United States, again, the United States has not taken a position on how the Taiwan question is resolved. The U.S. position has always been that's something for the people of Taiwan and China to come to an agreement on. But that, I guess that would be continuing the status quo as well from the U.S. point of view.
The import of Taiwan and semiconductor manufacturing, and the U.S. having some controls over what China gets as far as semiconductors, that goes out the window if China rules in any way economically the island, right?
Right. And so, the question, many people have said, what happens to TSMC if China were to take it over? If you ask people in Taiwan, some will say, well, you can't force TSMC to operate. If they're not interested in cooperating, they may not. But I don't think we want to go there. That's the whole point. We don't want to go there, and that's why the status quo, as unsatisfying it is to all sides, is probably the best way forward. And in order for us to keep that status quo, it's important that the United States continues to support Taiwan. There's really no other good solution. But I think China, they're short of a military intervention. There are other things that it can do to pressure Taiwan. It's doing a lot of it already by doing the military exercises around Taiwan, tiring out the Taiwanese military forces who have to respond every time that they do some sort of incursion or exercise. It could do an economic blockade of the island. There are many things that China could do short of a war, and that's why I think the war is probably Xi Jinping's least favorite option. I'm not saying he may not go there or he wouldn't ever go there, but I think he'd rather keep the pressure on them without having to go to war, because that would probably be devastating. Well, that would be devastating for everyone, right? Because that would bring international trade to a standstill. That would have implications for all the countries in the region. China would surely face economic sanctions from the United States, from Europe, and other Asian partners. So it would have a negative consequence for everyone involved. There really isn't a happy outcome.
Excellent presentation. Thank you very much. I keep searching for things that the United States can do in order to get China's attention, North Korea's attention, and Russia's attention, that there's serious things going on here that we don't agree with. And put the word out, maybe first quietly. The United States is willing to support South Korea and Japan moving toward acquiring nuclear weapons. That also gives them potentially a chance to defend themselves more directly if the U.S. is to pull back. How long we can guarantee, or they can expect us to guarantee using our own nuclear weapons, I think is an open question. But I think that would have an enormous impact geopolitically, opening up maybe China saying, maybe we need to work with the United States a little bit more. While we're at it, put Australia in the same bucket and work with them and try to free up, if you will, some of these tectonic plates out there. So many countries already have nuclear capabilities. Anyway, what do you think?
Well, yeah, I think that would be a scary world. If we had, I know you had Dr. Hecker here 2 weeks ago, where he probably talked about this. And what's concerning is that actually these conversations are already happening in South Korea and Japan without the U.S. encouraging it, because they are wondering how long can they rely on the American commitment? How long can they rely on the alliance? Do we need to have our own capabilities? Those are real questions that were being asked. Those used to be fringe conversations. But they've become more mainstream, and it's very concerning. And I think Beijing realizes this too. But often when you get Chinese experts and American experts in a room to talk about this, we like to say, well, that's going to be a bigger problem for you. So they'll say, oh, that's a bigger problem for you. They'll say that's an alliance management issue for you. And we'll say, well, these are your neighbors. You don't want them to go nuclear. That's going to make your direct neighborhood much more unstable. And so the bottom line is nuclear weapons are a problem for everyone, right? We can't, it's meaningless to say who it's more of a problem for, right? It's dangerous for the world. And so this is a common sense area where the US and China should be working together. And the one place where I do think there's actually a lot of agreement is on North Korea and the fact that it should not have nuclear weapons. I think the U.S. and China absolutely agree on that. But these issues like these are not getting the attention they deserve because we're too focused on fighting each other on trade. And so this is where hopefully we should be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. Where yes, we negotiate hard on trade and we make sure that we seek our best interests for our own countries. But we also have to work on areas where we have a clear common interest in not having nuclear proliferation. And I don't think South Korea and Japan going nuclear would be the end of the story then. That would be the beginning of a nuclear cascade around the world. And maybe South Korea and Japan, we can trust them to be responsible. But what about other countries that we don't trust to be as responsible? Or forget a country, what about terrorist groups or others who might get their hands on these nuclear weapons if they're more available? That just puts us in a more dangerous world. And so I would hope that we could be working with the Chinese and ideally the Russians too, right? Basically, we need all the P5 states to make clear that North Korea cannot be, it cannot keep its nuclear weapons, that it cannot be accepted as a nuclear weapons power.
And yet they still have nuclear weapons.
They do, yes.
They can threaten South Korea.
They can. They could threaten the U.S. too. They could threaten China. Yeah.
Well, it may not be relevant, and thank you so much for the phenomenal information. Is it time to get rid of the declaration of war with North Korea that is still in place?
You mean the...
We have declared war. We were at an armistice, which is timely. The declaration is not timely.
Oh, Well, I think I view... So we have an armistice. So we have an armistice that has brought the Korean War to a halt, but it's not ultimate. It's still technically a frozen war, not a resolved one. And so this is why there's been interest in advancing a peace deal that would officially transition from an armistice to a peace deal. And I think that is something that we should definitely work towards. I think that's something that South Korea very much wants. I think North Korea could want that as well. That would certainly be good for the U.S. as well. But the question is, how do we get there and what's in it? And I think it's very dangerous if we were to rush into a peace deal that did not include denuclearization in it for the reasons that we just talked about. And so that's where I think we need our diplomats to be getting together with North Korean diplomats, with South Korean diplomats to hammer out a mutually acceptable peace deal that takes into account denuclearization. But the challenge is, right now, the North Korean regime has come out very strong to say, we are now a nuclear power and you can't do anything about that. And if you want to talk about that, we're not coming to the negotiating table. That's what they've said publicly. And I worry that because President Trump is very eager to meet with Kim without properly resolving these issues at the working levels, he may rush to meet Kim and give away that leverage. And so that's what we really shouldn't be doing.
Dr. Kim, thank you for an in-depth, articulate, very enjoyable talk. What is your view on the South China Sea issues?
So in the South China Sea, we've seen China really step up to try to press its own territorial claims. As you know, there are many countries who claim the island features and rocks that are out in the South China Sea, and they've been clashing over those for decades. But because China has become so much more militarily powerful, it's really gotten an upper hand and it's become much more aggressive about pushing its claims out there. That's something that the United States has opposed. We've tried to show that by doing freedom of navigation operations in the region to say, hey, you can't just block off a huge swath of the sea and say it's yours. And this is where I think we've tried to work with countries like the Philippines and Vietnam so that they can sort of challenge and counterbalance Chinese claims. But yeah, it's I think China's official policy is that it's willing to negotiate and to discuss with these countries. There's something called a code of conduct that all the countries in the region have been working on that talks about sort of codes of conduct of how they should be behaving in these regions. But, there's kind of two things going on. The Chinese are talking nice about codes of conducts and negotiations and joint exploration, but at the same time, they are also very aggressively pressing their claims militarily. And so this is one area where I think the United States has an interest in freedom of navigation and should be pressing the Chinese on to sort of lower down their activities and making sure that that others in the region can push back when they're pushed by the Chinese.
Kim, thank you for coming to. I'm really glad you're coming to Colorado eventually. My question here is that many people have taken note that Trump's second term is very different from his first term. In his first term, he launched all-front confrontation with China. Now he is focusing only on the trade deal making. Not, as you said, not talking about China human rights, not talking about Taiwan issue, at least when talk about Taiwan issue, he does not care about defending Taiwan. He complaining about Taiwan's not paying for protection fee or hollowing out semiconductor sectors. And in that context, a lot of people in China now see opportunity. And they talk Trump as a 川建国. Trump is helping building China, not only on those issues, dividing America politically, and also destroy the U.S. alliance system and destroy the rules-based international order. So how do you respond to that type of talking?
Yeah, I think there is great concern. And, President Trump, as you mentioned, Shui-Sheng, has, when he's spoken about Taiwan, he's spoken about them as economic competitors, and he's implied that they've stolen our chip industry, which is not true. And so there's great concern, especially in Taipei, about what does this mean for their future and their relationship with the United States. We've seen some moves by the U.S. government to try to smooth the way to a Trump-Xi summit by telling Taiwanese officials, you can't come for this scheduled defense talks, or telling the president of Taiwan, you cannot transit through New York, which is something that other previous Taiwanese presidents have done. And I worry about that, because I think it presents these issues as if they're negotiable to the Chinese government. And I think that's the wrong thing to convey, that U.S. China, that the United States Taiwan policy, that the U.S. Taiwan relationship is something that can be negotiated away. I think that's a very dangerous place to be. I hope that there are plenty of people who know this inside the U.S. government, and so my hope is that they're giving good advice to the president so that he doesn't go there. But I think it's something that we need to continue to shine a light on, scholars and advisors, so that we don't go there, because it'd be dangerous.
Hope he will listen.
Yeah.
You mentioned TikTok earlier. I think this is in the news a lot. Is it really a national security threat? Do you think we're on the right track, the wrong track? What should we be doing?
Yeah, that's something that I don't have I don't know the technology in and out, and so it's hard for me. I've wrestled with that too. Is it really a national security threat? I do think it's a problem when there's an app where a government, that's owned by a different country, and that country has different rules, where the government can tell the app, hey, you need to give me the data on that app, and that is very much a threat, and that's compromising. And so I think the current TikTok deal is trying to restructure the ownership so that the Chinese government cannot, tell the Chinese company that owns TikTok to turn over Americans' data. And I think that's, we need to resolve that. There's also the concern that the Chinese government, or some other, can tell that company what kind of material to push through their algorithms so that people on TikTok, are pushed a certain narrative or pushed a certain viewpoint. That's very dangerous as well. And so I do think it's important for these sort of social media platforms to be governed in a democratic way, where certain speech isn't repressed or data is compromised. I do think those are actual challenges. Now, does the current deal, where it involves different American owners, a minority stake by a Chinese company, does that resolve for that? I'm not really sure because I don't know the technology through and through. I hope it does, but that's where the real experts, I think, need to be looking closely at, does this really actually get to the national security concerns that we initially had about this app so that it was banned.
Thank you.
I have a cultural question. Could you please explain the significance of October 1st to the People's Republic of China for Chinese nationals here in the United States and how it is recognized in the country of China?
Thank you. Well, you know what? Did Shui-Sheng leave? He left, because that would have been a great question for him. But as you say, it is National Day. And so I think there's a lot of pride in China about how far they've come. We talked about bringing billions of 1.4 billion people out of poverty. There's a lot of pride in where their country is going. They feel like, you may have heard of DeepSeek, which is a Chinese AI company that's supposed to rival some of the AI companies that we have in the United States. And so there's a lot of pride, but there's also anxiety. I do think there's anxiety about the economy, about youth unemployment, about social safety networks, about demographic challenges, all of the issues that came up. And so, the last time I was there, it was interesting. I was there in April, and this is when the trade war was actually launched with Liberation Day in that week of April. And so there was both a sense of defiance, but also a sense of concern. And so that's where I think China is today. I think, but it's not, it does feel different from the dynamism that I felt earlier in the 2000s, where China was growing rapidly. It seems like it's sort of hit a different pace. And so that's how I would describe sort of where China is today.
Other questions?
How much control does Xi Jinping, probably minister, have over the people in China? Is he a totalitarian, whatever?
Totalitarian, yeah. It's become a much, I do think he is more of an autocratic leader than his predecessors. I do think there used to be more, China was never a democracy, but there was more academic freedom in the past. I think people were more open to talking about politics, but I think that's changed over the last decade, where academics are which are the people that I interact with the most, are much more reluctant to talk freely. The only places where you can have real, genuine conversations are on the sidelines of meetings. When you have the official meeting, I think people are more comfortable sticking to the talking points. And so I think the political environment has become more closed. And again, this goes to sort of the what I was just describing, where it's not as dynamic of a place. A lot of private companies have been sort of pressured by the central government. Many famous entrepreneurs have been censured for stepping out of line or becoming too big. And so that's kind of the direction, and it's unfortunate to see where it is. And personally, me as a researcher, I don't feel as comfortable going and freely traveling around as I once did. I think it's changed. The system has changed a bit more than in the past. So I think for now, they're kind of on the wrong trajectory.
Do we have any other questions? No. Dr. Kim, thank you. What a wonderful program. We are so honored to have you. Thank you.